For over 2,000 years, the Bible has captivated millions of people around the world. But within its sacred pages, we don't only find teachings and divine promises. We also discover enigmas that have challenged theologians, historians, and archaeologists for centuries. Some of these mysteries remain unanswered to this day, generating passionate debates and theories ranging from the scientific to the supernatural. What were the Nephilim really? Where is the Ark of the Covenant? What did the prophet Ezekiel see in his vision of the wheels? These are just some of the questions we'll explore today, not to give definitive answers, but to invite you to reflect and form your own opinion. Welcome to a journey through the 7 most disturbing mysteries of the Bible. Let me warn you right now, what you're about to discover could change the way you understand Scripture. Prepare to question, to be amazed, and above all, to delve into the deepest enigmas of God's Word. Before we begin, I invite you to turn on notifications, leave a like, and at the end of the video, share in the comments which of these mysteries has impacted you the most. Now, let's get started. Mystery 1. The Nephilim. The giants before the flood. Our first mystery takes us to Genesis chapter 6, where we find one of the most enigmatic and disturbing passages in the entire Bible. Here the Nephilim are mentioned, beings described as giants who inhabited the earth in ancient times. But who were these beings really? Where did they come from? And most importantly, why has their existence been the subject of so much debate? The biblical text tells us, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. When the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. Here arises the first great question: who were these sons of God? Throughout history, 3 main interpretations have been proposed. The first suggests they were fallen angels, celestial beings who abandoned their spiritual nature to take physical form and unite with human women. This theory is supported by ancient texts like the Book of Enoch, which describes in detail how 200 angels descended to Mount Hermon and took human wives. The second interpretation proposes that the sons of God were simply powerful men, kings or rulers who abused their authority. According to this view, the term sons of God would refer to the descendants of Seth, Adam's 3rd son, while the daughters of men would be descendants of Cain. This union would have been problematic because it mixed the godly line with the ungodly line. A third theory, less common but equally fascinating, suggests they were hybrid beings, neither completely divine nor completely human, who possessed supernatural knowledge and abilities. But the real enigma doesn't end there. The Nephilim are described as giants of great stature and superhuman strength. The Hebrew word, Nephilim, probably derives from a root meaning the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall, suggesting they were beings who inspired terror and dominated through violence. The text tells us they filled the earth with wickedness, and many theologians believe their existence was one of the main reasons why God decided to send the universal flood. What's most disturbing is that these beings appear again after the flood. In the book of Numbers, when Moses sends 12 spies to explore the land of Canaan, 10 of them return terrified, reporting they had seen the Nephilim. "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." How could they have survived the flood? Or was there a second incursion of these beings? The Bible doesn't give us a clear answer, and this silence only fuels the mystery. Some suggest that the genes of the Nephilim survived through one of the wives of Noah's sons, though this contradicts the narrative that only Noah's family was righteous. Others propose there was a second union between celestial beings and humans after the flood. Archaeology hasn't remained oblivious to this enigma. Over the years, there have been reports of unusually large skeletal findings in various parts of the world, though the scientific community generally attributes them to diseases like gigantism or misinterpretations of fossil remains. However, legends of giants are not limited to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Cultures from around the world, from the Greek Titans to the Norse Jotun to traditions of giants in pre-Columbian America, have similar accounts. The mystery of the Nephilim remains one of the most debated in theological and academic circles. Were they really hybrids between angels and humans? Or simply men of great stature and power that oral tradition magnified over time? The Bible presents us with the enigma, but the final answer remains open to each person's interpretation. Mystery 2, the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred lost treasure. Of all the objects mentioned in the Bible, few have captured the collective imagination as much as the Ark of the Covenant. This sacred chest, covered in pure gold and crowned by 2 cherubim, not only represents one of the most important artifacts of ancient Judaism, but its disappearance constitutes one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of all time. According to the book of Exodus, God himself gave detailed instructions to Moses on how to build the ark. It was to be made of acacia wood, with specific dimensions: 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high, completely covered in gold inside and out. Inside would be kept the tablets of the law with the 10 Commandments, as well as other sacred objects like Aaron's rod and a container of manna. But the ark wasn't simply a container. Tradition holds that it was the place where the divine presence, the Shekinah, dwelt in a special way. It was so sacred that only the high priest could approach it, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. Biblical accounts attribute extraordinary powers to the ark, from the fall of the walls of Jericho to the instant death of those who touched it without authorization. The ark accompanied the Israelites during their journey through the wilderness and was finally placed in the Holy of Holies of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, around 1000 BC. And here begins the real mystery. What happened to it? The last reliable mention of the ark in Scripture is located during the reign of King Josiah, around 600 BC. After that, it simply disappears from the biblical record. When the Babylonians destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem in 586 BC, the ark doesn't appear in the meticulous lists of looted objects. It's as if it had vanished. The theories about its whereabouts are numerous and fascinating. One of the most popular, defended by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, claims the ark is in Aksum, Ethiopia. According to this tradition, Menelik I, son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, brought the ark to Ethiopia around 900 BC. There, supposedly, it remains guarded in a chapel of the Church of St. Mary of Zion, watched over by a guardian monk who dedicates his entire life to protecting it. No one, except this guardian, can see it. Another theory suggests that the prophet Jeremiah hid the ark on Mount Nebo, in present-day Jordan, before the Babylonian invasion. The apocryphal book of 2nd Maccabees mentions that Jeremiah, warned by divine revelation, took the ark to a cave on the mountain where Moses had gazed upon the promised land and sealed it there. A third hypothesis, popular among some archaeologists, proposes that the ark never left Jerusalem. It could be hidden in some secret tunnel excavated beneath the Temple Mount, the site where Solomon's temple once stood. However, the extreme political and religious sensitivity of the place makes exhaustive excavations impossible. More recently, declassified CIA documents have added an unexpected twist to this search. According to files from Project Sunstreak, a program that explored remote viewing, an agent claimed to have seen psychically the ark hidden somewhere in the Middle East, underground, in a dark and humid place. The Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron is even mentioned as a possible location. Some researchers from the Base Institute, founded by astronaut James Irwin, have dedicated more than 20 years to tracking the Ark in Ethiopia, presenting what they consider convincing circumstantial evidence. However, no theory has been conclusively verified. Historian Eric Klein suggests a more prosaic explanation, that the Ark was melted down to exploit its gold during one of Judah's financial crises. However, this wouldn't explain why its disappearance wasn't recorded, especially considering its enormous religious importance. The mystery of the Ark of the Covenant remains unsolved. Is it hidden somewhere waiting to be discovered? Was it destroyed millennia ago? Or perhaps its true purpose was to remain hidden, preserving the mystery of the sacred? Each theory has its defenders, but none has managed to convince everyone. And meanwhile, the most sacred chest of antiquity remains the most sought-after lost treasure in the world. Mystery 3. Ezekiel's vision. Celestial wheels or something more. We now enter one of the strangest and most visual passages in the entire Bible, the vision of the prophet Ezekiel. We're in the year 593 BC in Babylon, where the Jews live in captivity. It is here that Ezekiel, priest and prophet, has an experience that defies all conventional description. The text of Ezekiel chapter 1 describes an apparition that has puzzled theologians for millennia. The prophet sees something coming from the north. I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal. But this is just the beginning. Ezekiel then describes 4 living creatures, which he later identifies as cherubim, each with 4 faces, of a man, lion, ox, and eagle. Each being had 4 wings, and their feet were straight, shining like burnished bronze. But what's truly disturbing comes next: the wheels. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. Ezekiel describes wheels within wheels, perpendicular to each other, that could move in any direction without needing to turn. But here comes the most disturbing detail. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. Imagine that for a moment. Giant wheels, shining like precious stones, completely covered with all-seeing eyes. The vision continues. Above the heads of the living creatures was an expanse that sparkled like crystal, and above this expanse, a sapphire throne. And on the throne, a human-like figure surrounded by fire and a radiance like a rainbow. Ezekiel understands he is seeing the glory of God. The traditional interpretation sees in this vision a symbolic representation of divine majesty and omnipresence. The wheels would represent God's omnipresence, His ability to move instantly in any direction. The eyes would symbolize His omniscience. Nothing escapes His sight. The creatures with multiple faces would represent different aspects of creation under divine dominion. But in recent decades, this vision has been reinterpreted in surprising ways. Some researchers of extraterrestrial phenomena have suggested that Ezekiel may have witnessed the landing of a spacecraft. Joseph Blumrich, a NASA engineer, even designed a spacecraft model based on Ezekiel's descriptions, arguing that each detail could correspond to advanced technological components. The wheels within wheels would be helical rotors. The eyes would be windows or sensors. The noise, like many waters, would be the sound of engines. This interpretation, though fascinating, is controversial and rejected by most serious biblical scholars. However, it raises intriguing questions. Why did Ezekiel feel the need to describe everything in such technical detail? Why did he emphasize that the wheels could move in any direction without turning? A concept that for his time had no technological reference. The Jewish tradition has its own mystical interpretation. In Kabbalah, this vision is known as Ma'aseh Merkava, the work of the chariot, and is considered one of the deepest and most dangerous pieces of knowledge. It was so sacred that it was only taught to mature and spiritually prepared students, and never in public. What makes this vision particularly disturbing is its level of detail. Ezekiel isn't reporting a vague dream or an abstract mystical experience. He's describing something he saw, with almost technical precision, trying to find words for what seems to be beyond human language. He constantly uses phrases like "something that looked like" or "similar to," as if he were struggling to express the inexpressible. This vision is repeated with variations in chapter 10 of the book of Ezekiel, adding more details about the cherubim and the wheels, confirming that it wasn't a momentary hallucination, but an experience that profoundly marked the prophet. What did Ezekiel really see? Was it a divine revelation expressed in symbols that his mind could process? A transcendental mystical experience? Or perhaps, as some suggest, an encounter with technology that was thousands of years ahead of his time? Ezekiel's vision remains as one of the most enigmatic and debated passages of all biblical literature, a mystery that each generation tries to decipher according to its own frames of reference. Mystery 4. The number 666, the mark of the beast. Few numbers in history have generated as much fear, speculation, and conspiracy theories as 666. Known as the number of the beast, it appears in one of the most enigmatic and symbolic books of the Bible, the Revelation of John. The passage in question is found in Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. This verse has been the subject of countless interpretations over nearly 2,000 years. But before exploring the theories, we must understand the context. Revelation was written by John of Patmos, probably between the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, during a period of intense persecution against Christians. The book is full of apocalyptic symbolism, a literary genre common in that era that used fantastic images and codes to communicate political or religious messages in a veiled way. The beast mentioned in chapter 13 is described as a creature with 7 heads and 10 horns that comes from the sea and has authority over all the earth. The traditional interpretation holds that the number 6, which in biblical numerology represents imperfection, since it's just below 7, the number of divine perfection, repeated 3 times, symbolizes the total failure of human systems that attempt to usurp God's place. It's the Trinity of imperfection, a satanic parody of the divine Trinity. But there's another fascinating interpretation that has gained considerable support among scholars. Gematria. This is a system that assigns numerical values to letters, common in both ancient Hebrew and Greek. Each letter had a numerical value, and by adding up the letters of a name, you obtained a number that could be used as a code. Many scholars believe that 666 is a code pointing directly to Nero Caesar, the Roman emperor who brutally persecuted Christians. When Nero Caesar is written in Hebrew characters and the numerical value of each letter is added, the result is exactly 666. This theory is reinforced by a crucial detail. Some ancient manuscripts of Revelation give the number as 616 instead of 666. And 616 is the numerical value of Nero Caesar written in Latin. This historical interpretation suggests that John wasn't prophesying about a distant future, but was sending a coded message to Christians of his time about the demonic nature of the Roman Empire and particularly Nero without directly exposing himself to persecution. However, the futurist interpretation also has its defenders. Many Christians believe that Revelation describes events yet to come, and that 666 will identify a future world leader, the Antichrist, who will establish a tyrannical global government. According to this view, the mark of the beast, mentioned in the same chapter, will be a global economic control system where no one will be able to buy or sell without carrying this mark. Throughout history, countless figures have been identified as bearers of the number of the beast. From Roman emperors to medieval popes, from Napoleon to Hitler to modern politicians, practically any controversial or powerful figure has been, at some point, accused of being the 666. Some have even performed forced calculations with names of presidents or world leaders to make them add up to 666. The number has also generated a specific phobia, hexakosioi hexakonta, exaphobia, the fear of the number 666. Some people actively avoid this number in their daily lives, from phone numbers to addresses or vehicle license plates. But perhaps the true mystery isn't the specific identity of the beast, but the purpose of the enigma. The text itself says, "This calls for wisdom," suggesting that deciphering the number requires not just intelligence, but spiritual discernment. Perhaps the number works on multiple levels, historically pointing to Nero and the Roman Empire, prophetically warning about future tyrants, and symbolically representing all forms of evil that oppose God. What's undeniable is that this three-digit number has captured human imagination like few symbols in history. Whether we see it as a historical code, a future prophecy, or a timeless symbol of evil, 666 remains one of the most debated mysteries of the Bible. Mystery 5. The Star of Bethlehem. What guided the wise men? Every Christmas, we place a star atop our trees, remembering one of the most iconic events of the New Testament. But what really was the Star of Bethlehem? Was there any astronomical phenomenon that could explain this story? Or is it purely theological symbolism? The account appears exclusively in the Gospel of Matthew. According to the text, wise men from the east saw a star that they interpreted as the sign of the birth of the King of the Jews. They followed this star to Jerusalem, where they consulted King Herod. After this encounter, the star went ahead of them and guided them specifically to Bethlehem, stopping over the place where the child Jesus was. Right from the start, the account presents unusual characteristics for a conventional astronomical object. Stars don't move in a way that can guide travelers from one point to another, and they certainly can't stop over a specific house. This has led to decades of astronomical research trying to identify what celestial phenomenon might correspond to this description. The comet theory has been popular for centuries. In fact, many Renaissance paintings depict the Star of Bethlehem as a comet with a tail. We know that Halley's Comet passed by Earth in 11 BC. However, this date doesn't coincide with the most accepted estimates of Jesus' birth, which place it between 7 and 4 BC. Additionally, a comet would have changed position with Earth's rotation, making it difficult for it to serve as a constant guide. Ironically, in antiquity, comets were seen as omens of disasters, not good portents. A second theory proposes it was a nova or supernova, the explosive birth or death of a star. Chinese astronomers recorded a broom star in 5 BC, which could have been visible from the Middle East. However, no supernova remnants have been found that match that time and location. The closest recorded supernova visible from Earth was in 185 AD, too late for Jesus' birth. The most convincing theory from an astronomical standpoint is the Great Conjunction. A planetary conjunction occurs when, from Earth's perspective, two or more planets appear to be very close to each other in the sky. In 7 BC, Jupiter and Saturn had a triple conjunction in the constellation Pisces. That is, they visually approached each other 3 times over several months, an extremely rare event. This phenomenon has special significance in ancient astrology. Jupiter was known as the king planet. Saturn was associated with the Jews, and Pisces was the sign of the end times. For astrologers of the time, this triple conjunction in Pisces would have been interpreted as announcing the birth of a Jewish king with eschatological importance. Additionally, in 3 BC, there was another spectacular conjunction between Jupiter and Venus that would have made them appear as a single brilliantly bright light in the western sky, just after sunset. This phenomenon would have been visible from any point in the eastern Mediterranean and would have been interpreted as a sign of enormous importance. Some researchers have proposed a fourth, more radical theory, that the Star of Bethlehem wasn't an astronomical phenomenon at all, but a supernatural apparition specifically created to guide the wise men. According to this interpretation, the star was a direct manifestation of divine presence, similar to the pillar of fire that guided the Israelites in the wilderness. This would explain its unusual behavior, moving, stopping, and pointing to a specific place. A fifth possibility, less discussed but equally valid, is that Matthew's account is primarily theological and symbolic, not so much a literal historical report. Matthew wrote his gospel for a Jewish audience, and the symbolism of a star announcing the Messiah would resonate with Old Testament prophecies, such as Balaam's in Numbers 24. A star will come out of Jacob. What's fascinating is that these theories aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. God could have used a natural astronomical phenomenon, like a planetary conjunction, and given it special meaning and purpose. Or it could have been a combination of events, a natural phenomenon that initially caught the wise men's attention, followed by more specific supernatural guidance. The mystery of the Star of Bethlehem continues to captivate both astronomers and theologians. Every Christmas, when we look up at the night sky or place the star on our trees, we're remembering an enigma that has intrigued humanity for 2 millennia. Was it a celestial miracle, an astronomical phenomenon, or both? The question remains open, inviting us to gaze at the heavens with wonder and reverence. Mystery 6. Paul's conversion, the most radical change in history. Of all the accounts of personal transformation in the Bible, none is as dramatic, as sudden, or as historically verifiable as the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, who would become Paul the Apostle. This event not only changed the course of one life, but transformed the history of Christianity. But what really happened on the road to Damascus? Saul was a zealous Pharisee, Roman citizen, and scholar of Jewish law. He was completely convinced that the followers of Jesus were dangerous heretics who needed to be eliminated. The Acts of the Apostles tells us that Saul was breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He had even been present and approved the martyrdom of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. In the year 34 or 35 AD, Saul obtained letters from the high priest, authorizing him to arrest Christians in Damascus and bring them in chains to Jerusalem. It was a journey of approximately 225 kilometers, but he would never complete his mission. The account of what happened next appears 3 times in the book of Acts, each time narrated with slight variations, but maintaining the central elements. Near Damascus, at noon, a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, suddenly surrounded Saul and his companions. Saul fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" When Saul asked who was speaking, the answer was devastating. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." The man who had dedicated his life to eradicating Christianity had just encountered the risen Christ. Saul's companions saw the light and heard the sound, but didn't understand the words. When Saul got up, he was completely blind. For 3 days, Saul remained in Damascus without seeing, without eating, and without drinking, in a state that can only be described as profound spiritual shock. Then God sent a disciple named Ananias, who had understandable reservations about approaching the most feared persecutor of Christians. But God assured him, "This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings, and to the people of Israel." Ananias obeyed, laid his hands on Saul, and something like scales fell from his eyes. Saul regained his sight, was baptized, and immediately began preaching in the synagogues that Jesus was the Son of God. The transformation was so radical and so sudden that the Christians in Damascus couldn't believe it, and the Jews were so enraged that they conspired to kill him. But here's the real mystery. How do we explain this transformation? We're not talking about someone who gradually changed their mind or had a spiritual evolution. Saul literally went from persecutor to preacher in a matter of days. A man who had dedicated his life to destroying Christianity became its most passionate defender, and the author of approximately half of the New Testament. Skeptics have tried to explain this event in various ways. Some suggest that Saul suffered an epileptic seizure known as temporal lobe epilepsy, which can produce visual and auditory hallucinations and mystical experiences. Others propose it was heat stroke or severe sunstroke. A third theory suggests that Saul already had subconscious doubts about his persecution of Christians, and that the event on the road was a dramatized psychological crisis. However, these natural explanations face serious problems. First, they don't explain the total transformation of personality. People with epilepsy don't radically change their fundamental beliefs after a seizure. Second, they don't account for the testimony of Saul's companions, who also perceived something extraordinary. Third, and most important, they don't explain why Saul would dedicate the rest of his life, facing prison, torture, and eventually martyrdom, to preach something he knew was a hallucination. Historian Gerd Ludemann, a skeptic and atheist, admits that it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. This recognition from a critic is significant. What makes Paul's case particularly compelling as historical evidence is that he himself mentions it repeatedly in his letters, written only 20 or 30 years after the event. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lists the appearances of the risen Christ, including his own. And unlike the Gospels, which were written by third parties, here we have Paul's own first-person testimony. Paul didn't just change sides, he became Christianity's most brilliant strategist, carrying the gospel beyond Judea into the Greco-Roman world. He founded dozens of churches, wrote profound theological letters that formed the basis of Christian thought, and was finally martyred in Rome under Nero around 67 AD. Paul's conversion remains one of the most documented and least explainable events of ancient history. Was it really an appearance of the risen Christ? Or is there a natural explanation we haven't yet considered? What's indisputable is that something extraordinary happened on that road, something so powerful that it transformed not just one man, but the course of Western civilization. Mystery 7. The resurrection of Jesus, the most verifiable event or the greatest enigma. We now arrive at the most fundamental and most debated mystery of all Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. As the Apostle Paul said, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." All of Christianity stands or falls with this event. But what evidence do we have? Is it possible to examine this claim from a historical perspective? The basic facts are these. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate, Roman governor of Judea, during the Jewish Passover around 30 AD. He was buried in a borrowed tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin. 3 days later, on Sunday morning, the tomb was found empty by women followers of Jesus. In the following weeks, multiple individuals and groups claimed to have seen Jesus alive. And the disciples, transformed from terrified cowards to courageous preachers, began proclaiming his resurrection in Jerusalem, the same city where he had been executed. These fundamental facts are accepted by the vast majority of New Testament historians, regardless of their religious beliefs. Even Bart Ehrman, an agnostic and New Testament critic, states, "One of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate." Paula Fredrickson, a Jewish historian, adds, "The most solid fact about the historical life of Jesus is his execution as a political rebel." The empty tomb is particularly significant. The account that women were the first to discover the empty tomb is considered by many historians as evidence of authenticity. Why? Because in the 1st century, women's testimony wasn't considered legally reliable. If someone were inventing this story, they would have placed men, preferably prominent disciples, as the first witnesses. The fact that the Gospels present women suggests they're reporting what actually happened, even when it was embarrassing to do so. Additionally, the location of the tomb was known to both followers and opponents. If the body had still been there, the Jewish leaders or Romans would simply have produced the corpse, and that would have ended the Christian movement before it began. But they didn't. Instead, they circulated the story that the disciples had stolen the body, an accusation that ironically confirms the tomb was empty. The post-resurrection appearances are equally significant. Paul, writing only 20 to 25 years after the event, lists multiple appearances, to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom Paul says were still alive when he wrote an implicit invitation to verify the testimony, to James, the brother of Jesus, to all the apostles, and finally to himself. What's notable here is the variety of witnesses: individuals, small groups, a crowd of 500. Additionally, some of these witnesses were skeptics before the appearances. James, Jesus' brother, didn't believe in him during his ministry, but after an appearance of the risen Jesus, he became a leader of the church in Jerusalem and was eventually martyred for his faith. The conversion of skeptics is difficult to explain if the appearances were hallucinations or inventions. But the biggest enigma is the transformation of the disciples. These men had abandoned and denied Jesus during his arrest and crucifixion. Peter, their leader, denied him 3 times. They were hiding, terrified of meeting the same fate. But something changed radically. Suddenly, they were in the streets of Jerusalem, publicly proclaiming that Jesus had risen. They faced arrests, beatings, imprisonment, and death without recanting. It's important to note that they didn't die for an abstract religious belief or noble cause. They died affirming they had been eyewitnesses of specific events. People can die for lies they believe are true, but they hardly die for lies they know they invented. And all these men had multiple opportunities to save themselves by simply saying it had been a mistake or misunderstanding. Skeptics have proposed several alternative theories. The most common is the hallucination theory. The disciples, in their grief and desire for Jesus to be alive, had collective hallucinations. But hallucinations are individual, subjective experiences. They don't occur in groups, and certainly not to 500 people simultaneously. Additionally, hallucinations don't explain the empty tomb. The swoon theory proposes that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but lost consciousness and revived in the tomb. But this requires believing that Jesus, after being flogged, crucified, pierced with a spear, and left without food or water for 3 days in a cold tomb, somehow recovered the strength to move a 2-ton stone overcome Roman guards walk several kilometers with severe wounds and convince his disciples he had conquered death. The theory is medically and historically implausible. The stolen body theory suggests the disciples stole the corpse and faked the resurrection. But this doesn't explain why they would then die for what they knew was a lie, nor how a movement based on fraud could transform into the moral and spiritual force that changed the world. The explanation that best fits all the historical data is that the disciples genuinely believed they had seen the risen Jesus because they actually saw him. As historian N.T. Wright said, "The resurrection of Jesus is the best historical explanation for why Christianity came into existence, why the disciples transformed their lives so radically, and why they were willing to die for their testimony." Of course, believing in the resurrection requires being open to the supernatural, which many reject on philosophical principle. But from a purely historical perspective, the data consistently points in that direction. The empty tomb, the multiple appearances to diverse witnesses, the transformation of the disciples, the conversion of skeptics like Paul and James, and the explosive growth of Christianity in the very place where Jesus was executed, all of this demands an explanation, and the resurrection, however improbable it may seem, is the explanation that best accounts for all the evidence. The mystery of the resurrection remains. Is it the most verifiable event of antiquity, or the greatest enigma ever proposed? The answer each person gives to this question defines not only their historical perspective, but their entire worldview. We've journeyed through 7 of the deepest and most disturbing mysteries of the Bible, from the enigmatic Nephilim before the flood, to the whereabouts of the lost Ark of the Covenant, from Ezekiel's extraordinary vision with its wheels full of eyes, to the number 666 that has terrified generations. We've explored what celestial phenomenon guided the wise men, what transformed the persecutor Saul into the Apostle Paul, and finally, we've examined the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, the event that defines all of Christian faith. Each of these mysteries invites us to reflect, to investigate, to question, and for many, to have faith. The Bible doesn't present us with easy answers to all its enigmas. Sometimes it seems these mysteries were intentionally designed to keep us searching, thinking, debating. Which of these mysteries has impacted you the most? Do you have your own theory about any of them? I'd love to read your opinion in the comments. Remember, this is a space of respect and constructive debate. We all have valuable perspectives to share. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more content about biblical mysteries and fascinating faith topics. Turn on the bell to be the first to know when I upload new videos. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the most disturbing mysteries of the Bible. Until next time.